I didn't know my life was about to split into two versions of myself that morning: the woman I was before sunrise, and the woman I became after. My husband walked through the door at 6:15 a.m., the smell of cold air and unfamiliar perfume clinging to him. And when I asked why he was coming home at sunrise, he snapped at me like I was an inconvenience in my own marriage. "Stop questioning me," he said, his voice sharp and tired. "You're lucky I even come home." Lucky. I remember the way the word landed in my chest, heavy and final. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't throw accusations or demand explanations. I just looked at him across the kitchen counter, the coffee in my hands already cold, and said one word: "Noted." He went to bed like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just erased 6 years of marriage with a single sentence. I stayed there, sitting in the quiet kitchen, staring at the surface of my coffee, feeling something inside me finally go still. That was the moment I didn't suspect anything anymore. I knew. He didn't love me. Maybe he never had. And whatever he was doing out there in the dark, he didn't want me anywhere near the truth. That same night, while he was gone again, I packed my passport. I emptied the safe. I left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter and walked out of our apartment without a note, without a goodbye, without a second glance. By the time the sun came up, I was already driving toward the border, disappearing from the life he thought I'd always be waiting in. 4 years later, he finally saw me again. I was standing in a cafe in a city he never expected to find me in, calm, grounded, alive. And the woman standing beside me made his knees buckle. In that moment, I watched the realization hit him all at once: what he had thrown away, and who had been standing quietly beside me the whole time he was busy teaching me how grateful I was supposed to feel. This is the story of how I walked away without warning, without revenge, and without regret, and how leaving everything behind was the first honest decision I ever made. Before everything fell apart, I used to describe my life as ordinary in the best way. I was 32 when I left, but the version of me that stayed too long was built much earlier than that. My husband and I met in our early 20s, at a time when everything still felt possible and unfinished. We were young, ambitious in a vague way, convinced that love alone could carry us through whatever adulthood threw at us. He had confidence that filled rooms easily. I had patience, the kind that made people feel safe. We fit together quietly, without fireworks, and I mistook that steadiness for permanence. We married young. 6 years went by faster than I realized. We built a life that, from the outside, looked solid: a decent apartment, shared routines, weekend groceries, conversations about future trips and someday plans. He worked in marketing, traveled occasionally for conferences, and thrived in social spaces. People gravitated toward him. He liked that. I didn't mind it either. I trusted him completely, and trust made me generous with my silence. I worked steadily, kept our home running, balanced my own career with being present. I believed in partnership, in choosing each other every day, even when things felt dull or tiring. When he came home late from dinners or networking events, I didn't question it. When he said work was stressful, I listened. When he needed space, I gave it. That was who I was then: understanding, accommodating, proud of how little I needed to ask for reassurance. His family liked me well enough, though I was always aware of the invisible line I walked. His mother had opinions about how often I visited, how I spoke, how I handled disagreements. His sister treated our marriage like something temporary, something that could be replaced if it stopped being convenient. I noticed these things, filed them away, told myself every family had dynamics. I didn't want to be the difficult wife who read too much into harmless comments. The first changes were subtle enough to excuse. He stayed out later than usual. His phone started living face down on tables. Conversations became shorter, more distracted. When I asked how his night had been, or who he'd gone out with, he'd sigh as if I were draining him. "Why do you need to know everything?" he'd say. "You're always asking. It's exhausting." I learned to apologize for my curiosity. I learned to drop it. I told myself marriages go through phases. That stress looks like distance. That love doesn't always sound kind. When weeks turned into months, I adjusted again. I stopped waiting up. I stopped asking questions that made him defensive. I stopped expecting warmth when he came home. Instead, I focused on being reasonable, calm, low maintenance. I thought that if I made myself easy enough to live with, we'd find our way back to each other. But about 2 years before I left, the pattern stopped pretending to be accidental. He wasn't late once or twice a week anymore. He was gone most nights. Sometimes he came home at 2 in the morning, sometimes 3, sometimes not until the sky was already light. He wouldn't explain where he'd been. He'd shower, crawl into bed, and act as if nothing about it was unusual. And every time I told myself this was temporary, that I was overthinking, that loving someone meant enduring uncertainty. What I didn't realize then was that I wasn't enduring stress. I was slowly being erased. My needs became interruptions. My presence became optional. My questions became crimes. And the woman I was becoming learned how to survive quietly in a marriage that had already decided it no longer needed her. I didn't know yet how it would end. I only knew, looking back now, that the story was already breaking long before the morning he came home at sunrise. Looking back, the signs weren't loud. They didn't arrive as dramatic confrontations or undeniable proof. They crept in quietly, disguised as personality shifts, stress, and the natural erosion people warn you about when marriages get comfortable. That's what made them so dangerous. They taught me how to doubt my own instincts. He stopped sharing details about his life the way he used to. Stories became summaries. Summaries became silence. When I talked about my day, he listened with half his attention, eyes flicking to his phone, nodding at the wrong moments. I learned to trail off mid-sentence because I could feel when I'd lost him. He didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't care enough to correct it. Friends started to comment in small, offhand ways. "He's always out lately, huh?" someone joked once at a gathering. Another asked if I ever got tired of eating dinner alone. I laughed it off every time, the practiced smile of someone who didn't want to look foolish for trusting her husband. Inside, though, a quiet unease was growing, pressing against my ribs whenever I heard his keys late at night. His family became bolder, too. His mother suggested I was too sensitive. His sister hinted that men needed freedom, that I should be grateful he was still coming home at all. The phrase stung even then, but I swallowed it. I didn't want to be the wife who made problems bigger by naming them. I told myself it wasn't their place to understand our marriage anyway. At home, the atmosphere changed. Conversations felt like negotiations instead of exchanges. I weighed every question before asking it, wondering if it would trigger another sigh, another irritated look, another reminder that I was asking too much. When I did speak up, he responded like I was accusing him of something, even when I wasn't. "Why are you interrogating me?" he'd say, his tone already defensive. "Can't you just trust me?" So I tried harder to trust. I convinced myself that love meant restraint, that being a good wife meant not keeping score, not demanding reassurance, not asking for explanations that made him uncomfortable. I told myself that if something were truly wrong, I'd feel it clearly. That certainty would announce itself. What I didn't understand then was that certainty often arrives quietly after denial has exhausted itself. The last 6 months were the hardest. He stopped pretending there were reasons for his absences. No excuses, no apologies, just disappearance and return, as if our home were a hotel and I were part of the furniture. When he came back in the early hours of the morning, he moved around me like I wasn't there, like my presence was something to step over rather than acknowledge. I started sleeping lightly, my body waking at every sound, my mind replaying the same questions over and over. Where was he? Who was he with? Why didn't he care how this felt? I never asked those questions out loud. I was too tired of being told I was imagining things, too tired of feeling like I had to prove my right to be hurt. Instead, I began to prepare without admitting it to myself. I scanned documents and saved them digitally. I checked my passport's expiration date. I opened a separate bank account and transferred small amounts of money, telling myself it was just being responsible. I didn't call it an exit plan. I called it caution. But somewhere deep down, I think I already knew I was building a door. By the time that Thursday morning arrived, the tension wasn't new anymore. It was familiar, settled, waiting. And when he finally walked through the door at sunrise, irritation already in his eyes, I realized the conflict hadn't started that day. It had been growing quietly for years, feeding on every excuse I made for him and every piece of myself I put away to keep the peace. That Thursday morning is burned into me with a clarity I didn't have before it happened. I remember it was Thursday because I had taken the day off work, thinking maybe I'd surprise him with breakfast. Maybe we'd finally have a quiet morning together. I hadn't slept much. By the time the sky began to lighten, I was already awake, sitting alone in the kitchen with a mug of coffee I'd reheated twice and never finished. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I kept glancing at my phone, not to text him, but out of habit. Around 6 in the morning, I heard the lock turn. The door opened slowly, cautiously, like he wasn't sure whether he wanted to be seen. When he stepped inside at 6:15 a.m., he froze the moment our eyes met. "You're up early," he said, forcing a casual tone that didn't quite land. "I didn't sleep much," I replied. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I was waiting for you." He shifted his weight, dropped his bag on the counter a little too hard. "I texted you. I said I'd be late." "You texted at midnight," I said quietly. "You said you'd be home soon. It's 6 in the morning." There it was, the pause. The split second where he decided whether to explain or attack. He chose the latter. "I ran into some friends," he said. "We lost track of time." "For 6 hours?" I asked. My hands were wrapped around the mug, my fingers numb. "I'm not interrogating you. I'm just asking why you didn't come home until sunrise." That was when his expression hardened. He turned fully toward me, his eyes sharp, his jaw tight. "Stop questioning me," he snapped. "You're lucky I even come home." The words echoed in the small kitchen. Lucky. As if my place in his life were something he granted out of generosity instead of commitment. As if 6 years of marriage had been reduced to a favor he could revoke whenever he felt inconvenienced. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't raise my voice. I felt something inside me go very quiet, very still, like a door finally closing. I nodded once and said the only word that felt honest. "Noted." He scoffed under his breath, picked up his bag, and walked past me toward the bedroom. Within minutes, I heard the shower running. He went to bed like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just said something that permanently altered the way I saw him. I stayed in the kitchen long after the coffee went cold. I stared at the ring on my finger, at the life I'd been defending with silence and patience and self-doubt. That was the moment I knew. Not suspected, not feared, knew. He didn't love me anymore, and whatever he was doing, whoever he was with, mattered more to him than the woman waiting at home. I spent the rest of the day thinking, not spiraling, not crying, thinking. By evening, the decision was clear in a way nothing else had been for years. I wasn't going to confront him. I wasn't going to demand answers or beg for honesty. I wasn't going to give him the opportunity to explain, manipulate, or convince me that I was overreacting. I was going to leave, completely, quietly. That night, when he left again around 8, claiming he had a work thing and would be back late, I didn't ask a single question. I waited until the door closed behind him, then stood up and started packing. I moved with calm precision. One suitcase, essentials only. Clothes, laptop, personal items. Everything else stayed. I went to the safe in the bedroom closet, the one he didn't know I'd changed the combination to 2 months earlier, when my unease had finally turned into preparation. Inside was about $30,000 in cash, our savings. I took it all. Half of it was mine, and I wasn't asking permission anymore. I placed my wedding ring on the kitchen counter. No note, no explanation, just the ring. At 11 p.m., I walked out of the apartment and didn't look back. By 4 in the morning, I crossed the border. By noon, I was in another country entirely, checking into a small hotel where no one knew my name. That was the moment my old life ended, and the moment a different one finally began. The first thing that surprised me was the quiet. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of pressure. No waiting for keys in the lock, no rehearsing questions in my head, no calculating how much of myself I needed to shrink to keep the peace. When I closed the hotel room door behind me and set my suitcase down, the silence felt unfamiliar, almost too big, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt like relief finally had room to breathe. I expected guilt to crash into me once the adrenaline wore off. I expected tears, panic, second thoughts. Instead, what came was a strange, steady calm. I turned off my phone that first night, removed the SIM card, and left it on the desk like a symbol of the life I'd stepped out of. The next day, I bought a new phone with a new number. No one from my old world could reach me unless I allowed it, and I didn't. I moved through those first days on instinct. I ate when I was hungry. I slept when I was tired. I walked the unfamiliar streets of the city I'd researched for months without admitting why. Low cost of living, good infrastructure, Enough foreigners that I wouldn't stand out. It had all seemed theoretical before. Now it was survival. Every so often, a thought would surface. What did he do when he came home and found me gone? Did he panic? Did he call my name through empty rooms? Did he notice the ring on the counter right away, or only later when the reality began to sink in? I let myself wonder, but I never reached for answers. Curiosity had trapped me once already. I wasn't going to let it pull me backward. Within the first week, I found a small apartment. Nothing fancy, clean, safe. I paid 6 months' rent up front in cash and signed the lease without anyone asking questions. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, placing my things where I wanted them instead of where they fit around someone else's habits. That alone felt revolutionary. Work helped anchor me. I'd been doing freelance work remotely for years, quietly building skills and contacts in the background of my marriage. Within a month, I had enough clients to support myself comfortably. The independence tasted different than I'd imagined. Less triumphant, more solid, like standing on ground that didn't shift beneath my feet. I didn't contact anyone from my old life, not friends, not family. I knew how information traveled. I knew how quickly concern turned into questions, and questions into pressure. I needed a clean break, not a debate. So I let myself disappear completely. I learned new routines, new cafes, new streets. I learned how to exist without explaining myself. Around the third month, something unexpected happened. I stopped bracing myself for the past. I realized I wasn't checking over my shoulder anymore. I wasn't flinching at raised voices or sudden changes in tone. My body was slowly unlearning the tension it had carried for years, the constant alertness, the readiness to justify my feelings. I hadn't realized how deeply it had settled into me until it began to loosen. It was around that time that I started going to the same small cafe near my apartment every morning. Same hour, same table, same coffee. It became a ritual, a way of marking days that no longer revolved around someone else's schedule. And that was where I first noticed her. She came in at the same time every day, always alone, always carrying a book or a folder under her arm. At first, we only acknowledged each other with small nods, faint smiles, nothing more. I wasn't looking for connection. I wasn't looking for anything at all. I was still figuring out how to live inside myself again. One morning, the cafe was unusually crowded. She hesitated near my table, then asked if she could sit with me. No other seats were available. I said yes without thinking much of it. We started talking casually. Weather, coffee, the neighborhood. She told me she was a translator, fluent in 4 languages, local to the area. She was intelligent without trying to impress, funny in a quiet, observant way. We didn't talk about our pasts. We talked about books, about food, about the small details of daily life. We became friends first, naturally, without expectations. And in that ease, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safe. I didn't know then how important she would become. I only knew that for the first time since I left, I wasn't just surviving. I was slowly, carefully, beginning to feel like myself again. Friendship has a way of disarming you when you're not looking for anything more. With her, there was no rush, no intensity that felt like escape or replacement. We met at the cafe a few times a week, sometimes daily, sometimes not at all. There were days we talked for hours, and days we barely exchanged more than a smile. What mattered was that nothing felt forced. I wasn't performing. I wasn't proving my worth. I was simply present. As the months passed, my life continued to stabilize in ways I hadn't expected. Work expanded. Clients referred other clients. My calendar filled with projects that challenged me and paid well. I began to feel competent again, not just as someone's wife, but as my own person. That sense of independence changed how I moved through the world. I walked straighter. I spoke more clearly. I trusted my reactions instead of immediately second-guessing them. Meanwhile, the echoes of my marriage didn't disappear completely. They surfaced in quieter moments. In the way I hesitated before sharing something personal, in the instinct to apologize when I took up space, in the reflex to downplay my own needs. She noticed these things before I did, not in a way that pushed or pried, but in small, gentle questions. "Are you okay?" "You don't have to explain that. You can say no." Those words landed differently than reassurance ever had in my marriage. They weren't defensive. They weren't conditional. They didn't come with a sigh or an eye roll. They were simply offered, and I was free to accept or ignore them. Slowly, without naming it, something shifted. By the time our friendship turned into something more, it felt less like a decision and more like an acknowledgement. We started having dinner together, walking through the city at night, talking about everything and nothing until conversations stretched into early hours. She made me laugh in ways that surprised me. She listened without waiting for her turn to speak. When she disagreed with me, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like engagement. I didn't tell her about my marriage at first, not because I was hiding it, but because it didn't feel like the center of who I was anymore. When I finally did tell her, about a year after I'd left, it wasn't dramatic. We were sitting in my apartment, the windows open, the city humming below us. I told her why I'd left, how it had ended, how I'd chosen disappearance over confrontation. She listened quietly, never interrupting. When I finished, I waited for judgment, for questions, for doubt. Instead, she said, "You did what you needed to do. That takes courage." I laughed softly, more out of disbelief than humor, or cowardice. She shook her head. "Leaving something that's hurting you isn't cowardly. Staying and pretending it's fine is." Something in me settled when she said that. A piece I hadn't realized was still unsettled. From that point on, we didn't rush anything. We didn't label ourselves quickly. We just continued building what we already had. Steady, real, honest. By the second year, we moved in together. By the third, I couldn't imagine my life without her. I was happy in a way that didn't require vigilance, happy without waiting for the other shoe to drop. And in that happiness, I rarely thought about my husband anymore. Not because I was avoiding the past, but because it no longer held power over my present. What I didn't know was that while I was quietly rebuilding my life, the one I'd left behind hadn't let go, and that the distance I thought would protect me forever was slowly, inevitably, shrinking. The darkest moments don't always announce themselves with chaos. Sometimes they arrive disguised as peace, slipping in just when you think the hardest part is behind you. For me, it happened in the quiet certainty that I was finally safe, that the past had loosened its grip enough to stop reaching for me. Years had passed. I had rebuilt myself piece by piece, not as an act of defiance, but out of necessity. My life was full in ways I hadn't known how to want before. I loved my work. I loved the city. I loved the woman beside me. And yet, somewhere beneath that happiness, there was still an unspoken fear. The kind that comes from knowing you once trusted completely and paid for it dearly. It surfaced in small ways. A sudden tightening in my chest when someone raised their voice, a fleeting urge to explain myself when I didn't need to. A momentary panic when plans changed without warning. I didn't talk about these things often. They felt like private scars, not wounds that needed tending. I told myself healing wasn't linear, that this was normal. Then came the trip. We decided to take a long weekend away, just the two of us. She wanted to show me a neighboring city she'd grown up visiting, a place she spoke about with warmth and nostalgia. She promised the best food, the most beautiful architecture, and energy that felt alive without being overwhelming. I agreed easily. Travel with her felt effortless. There was no tension, no negotiations, no emotional accounting. The first day was perfect. We wandered narrow streets, shared plates of food, laughed at nothing in particular. I remember thinking, more than once, how far I'd come. How the woman I used to be would never have believed this kind of happiness was possible without constant compromise. The second day, we stopped at a cafe for lunch. It was crowded, loud with conversation and clinking dishes. We found a small table near the window. I was studying the menu when I felt her hand touch mine, not casually, but firmly. I looked up at her face and saw something shift in her expression. Her eyes had fixed on something behind me. "Is that?" she whispered. I turned. Across the cafe, near the entrance, stood my husband. Except he wasn't my husband anymore. I had filed for divorce 2 years after I disappeared. It had been finalized quietly through a lawyer. He never contested it. Probably didn't know where to send the paperwork. Still, seeing him there felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. He looked older, thinner, tired in a way I didn't recognize from memory. His eyes were locked on mine, wide with shock, as if he were staring at a ghost. For a moment, neither of us moved. The noise of the cafe faded into a dull hum. I was acutely aware of my heartbeat, of my breath, of the warmth of the hand still holding mine. Then he started walking toward our table. My instincts surprised me. I didn't freeze. I didn't panic. I didn't reach for an exit. I squeezed her hand back and said quietly, "Let him come." As he approached, I felt something old stir in my chest. Not love, not anger, recognition. This was the man who had once reduced me to gratitude for scraps of attention. This was the man I had left without a word. And standing there now, watching him struggle to process the reality in front of him, I realized something unsettling. This moment wasn't his reckoning. It was mine. He stopped a few feet away from our table, close enough that I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the exhaustion he no longer bothered to hide. For a moment, he just stared at me, as if saying my name might make me disappear again. "It's really you," he said finally, his voice unsteady. "It's really me," I replied. I've looked for you for years." His eyes flicked briefly to the woman beside me, then back again, as if afraid to linger too long. "You just vanished." I didn't want to be found. The words came out calmly, without heat. They surprised him. They surprised me too. He swallowed, shifting his weight. "Who is this?" he asked, gesturing toward her. "That's none of your business," I said, my tone firm but controlled. "You disappeared," he insisted. "No explanation. Nothing. I came home and you were just gone." "You told me I was lucky you even came home," I said evenly. "You made it very clear how little I mattered." His face tightened. "I didn't mean it like that." "Yes, you did." He flinched. For the first time I saw something crack in him. Not regret exactly, more like fear. The fear of someone realizing too late that they'd lost control of a story they assumed would always center them. "I was confused," he said quickly. "I was going through something. I didn't think you'd actually leave." "I don't care what you were going through," I replied. "You made your choices. I made mine." He looked down, then back up again, his voice dropping. "So that's it? You just left and built a whole new life?" "Yes." The simplicity of the answer seemed to hit him harder than any accusation could have. He glanced at her again, his gaze lingering this time. "How long?" he asked quietly. She answered before I could. 3 years. His face crumpled, color draining from it. 3 years, he repeated. "You've been with someone else for 3 years while I've been trying to find you." "You had 6 years to decide how to treat me," I said calmly. "You chose to come home at sunrise and tell me I should be grateful." "I made mistakes," he said, his voice breaking. "I know that now." "Mistakes are accidents," I replied. "You made choices. There's a difference." He stepped closer. "Can we talk alone? Please, I just need closure." "No," I said. "You don't get to ask for that from me." Tears welled in his eyes, spilling over as he spoke. "I loved you. I still love you." "You loved having someone waiting at home," I said quietly. "You didn't love me." "That's not fair." "It's completely fair." I stood then, feeling steady in a way I never had in his presence before. She stood with me, her hand slipping into mine like it belonged there. "We're leaving," I said. "Don't follow us." We walked past him without another word. He didn't try to stop us. As we stepped out into the sunlight, I felt the final thread tying me to my old life snap cleanly. For the first time, I understood something with absolute clarity. Closure isn't something another person gives you. It's something you claim the moment you stop asking for permission to move on. We didn't speak for several blocks after we left the cafe. The city moved around us, alive and indifferent, and I let that normalcy ground me. My breathing slowed. The tightness in my chest eased. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been holding in reserve until it finally drained away. Back at the hotel that night, she watched me carefully, not hovering, not pulling away, just present. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, sitting beside me on the bed. I thought about the question for a moment, actually checking in with myself instead of answering automatically. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." "You handled that well," she said. "I've had 4 years to imagine what I'd say if I ever saw him again," I replied. "Turns out I didn't need most of it." "Do you feel bad?" she asked. I shook my head. "No." "Do you think you should?" "No," I said again, more certain this time. He made his choices. I made mine. She leaned over and kissed my forehead, gentle and unassuming. "Good." We left the city the next morning. I didn't see him again. I didn't expect to. I assumed that encounter would be the final punctuation mark on a chapter that had already been closed for years. I was wrong about one thing. A week later, an email appeared in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Please read this." I almost deleted it without opening it. But something in me paused. Not hope, not curiosity, a sense of completion. It was from him. He wrote that he didn't know how he'd found my email, that he'd hired someone, that he knew it sounded desperate, but he had been desperate. He said he needed me to know the truth, that he'd been having an affair for almost a year before I left, that he'd ended it after I disappeared, realizing too late what he'd lost, that he'd spent 4 years regretting not just the affair, but the way he'd treated me. He said he knew I was with someone else now, that he knew I'd moved on, that he didn't expect forgiveness. He just wanted me to know he understood, finally, how badly he'd failed me. He ended by saying he hoped I was happy, that I deserved to be. I read the email twice, not because it moved me, but because it confirmed what I'd already known in my bones the night I left. The truth hadn't changed anything. It didn't hurt. It didn't heal. It simply existed. I closed my laptop and went into the other room where she was reading. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Everything's fine." I never replied to the email. I didn't delete it either. I left it there, unread and unanswered, because it no longer required my energy. His regret was his to carry, not mine. The fallout didn't look like revenge or humiliation. It looked like quiet consequences. His marriage collapsed. His control evaporated. His story no longer centered him. And for the first time, I understood that walking away without looking back wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. It's been 6 months since we ran into each other in that cafe. I haven't heard from him since the email, and I don't expect to. Some stories end with dramatic apologies or grand gestures. Ours ended with silence, and that silence has been more peaceful than any explanation he could have offered. My life now is quiet in the best way. We're still together, still choosing each other without pressure or urgency. We talk about marriage sometimes, not as a deadline or a promise we're rushing toward, but as a possibility that can wait until it feels right. There's no fear underneath those conversations, no need to prove anything, just mutual respect and steady affection. I think about my old life occasionally, not the marriage itself, but the version of me who stayed too long, the woman who explained away neglect, who confused patience with love, who believed that being low maintenance was the same as being valued. That woman doesn't exist anymore. She taught me what I needed to learn, and then she stepped aside. Leaving without warning wasn't an act of cruelty. It was the first time I chose myself without asking for permission. I didn't leave to punish him. I left because staying was slowly erasing me. And the truth is, sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away completely, without giving the other person one more chance to tell you you're asking for too much. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's this. Love should never make you feel grateful for scraps. Commitment should never sound like a threat. And if someone teaches you that your presence is optional, believe them the first time. I didn't rebuild my life out of anger. I rebuilt it out of self-respect. And on the other side of that decision, I found a version of myself who knows her worth, trusts her instincts, and no longer waits to be chosen. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't staying and fighting for something that's already gone. Sometimes it's leaving quietly, closing the door behind you, and becoming the person you were always meant to be. And I don't regret it, not for a second.